Hello, everybody. Good day, good morning, good evening to all of you, wherever you are. I hope you're doing very well. And welcome to the 91st live episode of Ask Abhijit. As you know, we are discussing the situation in Ukraine today. Before I begin, a very brief announcement. I have created a separate short clips channel. Here is the link to the channel. It's youtube.com/Abhijit Chavda clips. The link is also in the description below. So henceforth, going forward, all the short clips will be uploaded to that separate channel. So in case you want to you know, in case you want to stay up to date, please subscribe to the short clips channel. Right? Okay. So as you know, today we are. I am taking questions from the comment that you have. That you have asked. So let's get right into it. Let's begin with question number one. Okay, this is by Samarth. What is the exact objective of the Russian invasion? Is it to conquer the entire Ukraine or just remove the pro-West government or occupy eastern Ukraine? Will China be economically controlling Russia now after all the sanctions? It seems like Russia might fall into a debt trap and so on. Is China the biggest threat now? Right, a good question. So the last live streams that I did were 1 week ago, 26, 27 February. The Russian intervention in Ukraine began on the 24th of February. So the last live stream at that time, the situation was very much fluid. We have far more clarity today. So, what do we know about the Russian objectives? We know that the Russian army, the Russian armed forces, are proceeding very systematically. There is no hurry. They are not trying to rush into anything. They are proceeding very slowly, systematically, not very slowly, but very systematically. So, what seems to be the objective? The objective has never been explicitly announced, but what it looks like is it looks like Mr. Putin wants to capture whatever territory he intends to capture as intact as possible. As we know, the internet is still working in Ukraine, right? All communication lines are open. Electricity is available in most of the places. There are, I mean, the invasion forces are even obeying the traffic laws, traffic rules, and everything. So it's a very systematic invasion. They are not trying to engage in any big battles. They are not. They're trying as far as possible to avoid civilian casualties. There are lots of videos circulating where people are coming face to face with Russian soldiers carrying Ukrainian flags and protesting, and the Russians are just looking at them. They're not doing anything. There's no violence, brutality, and all that. So we can see that there is a very clear plan that they are following. So the objective of the invasion seems to be regime change. What seems to be the objective is they want to remove the uh, NATO puppet government that was installed beginning in 2014. At that time, it was a different president. Today, we have the actor comedian president Zelensky, right? So he is obviously a pro NATO, pro West person. So he most likely. The intention is to remove him and to replace him with somebody else who is pro Russia. So replace a pro NATO puppet with a pro Russia puppet. Well, that's how things work. And the Donbass region will be most likely be annexed into Russia. That's one possibility. And the eastern part of Ukraine would become more or less part of Russia. Possibly, see, the thing is, if you look at Ukraine, there are lots of Russian speaking people there. The only place where I believe there is a Ukrainian speaking majority is the western one third of the country. So maybe that may be left aside, possibly. So we still don't know exactly what the objectives are. What I can definitely tell you is that there is going to be regime change in Kiev. So the current government will be removed and a different new government, pro Russia government, will be installed, and that seems to be the objective. So I don't know if the entirety of Ukraine will be conquered. That's not what's happening right now. They have very clear military objectives and they are moving with pinpoint precision. So definitely a regime change is going to happen. That's what I can tell you for sure. That's the amount of clarity we have as of today. Okay, the next bunch of questions is about Why is Russia dragging the process of war? Is there any motive hidden behind this tactic? Anish says the war is being dragged on for longer than expected by Mr. Putin. He must have anticipated Kiev to fall within 2 3 days of the attack. If it is true, how do you think it will impact the conflict? Will Mr. Putin be more aggressive to get Kiev as soon as possible? And Rishikesh says, if Russian defense forces are so powerful, why is it taking so much time for them to achieve their objectives? Okay, so this is the impression that the media is giving us. They are saying that the Russian invasion or the intervention has been bogged down. Why is it that they have not been able to take Kiev and so on? And the comparison that we have is the various American invasions of various parts of the world. Let's say the 2003 invasion of Iraq, or the invasion of Afghanistan, or the invasion of Libya, and so on and so forth, Yugoslavia, Kosovo, so many things. And typically, when the Americans invade a country, they go shock and awe. So they begin with a massive aerial bombardment. All the videos are still available on YouTube, I'm sure, Baghdad, etc. They just flatten the place, and then they move in because there is nothing left to resist them. So, and when they are moving in, if there is any resistance if there is anything in the way, they just annihilate that. Right, friend, foe, doesn't matter. Just wipe everything out, then move in, and then you establish peace and democracy in whatever wasteland is left. So that is the American way of doing things. The Russians are not doing that. The Russians are not trying to flatten Ukraine. They're not trying to destroy the cities, right? They're not. Where's the Russian Air Force? They're doing nothing with the Air Force. The Air Force is just there, some helicopters here and there, one or two aircraft once in a while, but you don't see any major involvement of the Air Force. And yet we know that in the first 2 3 hours, the Russians had achieved complete air supremacy over Ukraine. Whatever the media is telling you doesn't matter. Because if you see, there are so many long, 40-mile long columns of Russian vehicles going towards Kiev. If the Ukrainian Air Force was still active, how come there is nothing being, they are not able to target the convoys of the Russians? It proves that the Ukrainian Air Force has been neutralized completely. The Russians have complete air supremacy, and they are choosing not to use their Air Force because they don't want to, well, they don't want to do bombardment the way the Americans do. So that's what we know. Now, if you want to look at the, let me show you some images. 1 second. So we will know how it's working. So this, yeah, this is a map of the invasion on the second day. Okay, the second day after the invasion, this is how it was. So the yellow territories are the red one is Donetsk and Luhansk, which the Russians already controlled to some extent. The yellow territories are the ones that the Russians wanted to advance into, and there was some military action going on in these areas. So this is on day 2. This is day 4. The red territories are the ones the Russians had already taken control of, right? So you can see over here, there is this encircling happening. The blue areas are where the Ukrainian armed forces are present, and they are trying to encircle them, the Russians, right? So this is day 4. This is, I think, a day or so before today. So you can see there is significant progress happening. So in just 10 days, they have achieved this much progress. This is faster than the American invasion of Iraq, and it is faster than the German blitzkrieg into France in the Second World War. So it may look like a slow, steady thing. It's not slow at all. It is moving at very good pace. The way the media portrays it will be like nothing is happening. The media commentators, especially the Western media, they're saying that the invasion is going to fail and Mr. Putin is going to be ousted because this is a disaster, and so on and so forth. But look at the progress you're seeing on the maps. There are two ways of looking at things. You see, there are two ways of looking at things. One thing is to look at social media, look at all the propaganda that's cropping up, videos from, they will show some destroyed Russian vehicles here, or some helicopter that's been shot down there. So you get all these different data points. There is one way of looking at it. That is the bottom up approach of examining a military campaign. There is a different approach called the top down approach, in which you look at maps. You look at the big picture, and I just showed you the big picture. That is the correct way of looking at the progress of a military campaign. And you can see the steady increase in the territory that the Russians are controlling. And also, you can see a very clear purpose in what they're trying to achieve. They're trying to encircle the Ukrainian armed forces, and then they will hopefully make them surrender. I hope so. And they want to take Kiev, but they're not going into Kiev. They are also surrounding Kiev, and then they will wait. So it's a very systematic way of doing things. So there is no dragging that's happening. It's happening very systematically, step by step, and they are trying their best not to cause any civilian casualties or any avoidable damage as far as possible to civilian infrastructure and all that. That's what they are trying to do. This is a war. In war, once you set things in motion, you can't control everything, but they are trying their best not to cause any unnecessary destruction. Okay, Ashish says, my question is that has Putin underestimated the defense power of Ukraine, or is there a bigger plan? Like we have only seen phase one, the bigger strike is yet to come. So Mr. Putin has not underestimated the defense power of Ukraine. Where is the defense? Uh, the Ukrainian armed forces are not I mean, what are they doing? Have you seen a single proper battle between two armies, two armed forces? Have you seen any artillery battle, any air force battle? Have you seen any of that, or any missile battle, in which you see equal amounts of firepower from both sides? You don't see any of that. Where are the Ukrainian armed forces? Right? They have been subdued. They are essentially hiding, and they may hopefully surrender. I mean, the Russians have way outmatched the Ukrainians. And as you can see, the Ukrainian Air Force is not to be seen anywhere. I think within the first 3 hours or so, the Russians had neutralized the Ukrainian Air Force with these very targeted pinpoint cruise missile strikes at various airports and various radars and things such as that, military installations. So I think that Mr. Putin has not underestimated anything. You don't plan for a long time and then end up underestimating something. So this is so what we are seeing is tactics and strategies that harken back to the USSR days. The Soviet army used to use similar tactics. For instance, if you look at the picture, if you look at this map here, then you will see in this region, if you can see my mouse pointer, you can see there is this blue region here where the Ukrainian armed forces are entrenched, and they are being encircled by the Russian army. So this strategy is called the cauldron strategy. They are encircling the opponent, creating a cauldron, a closed cauldron, and then they can do as they wish with them. This is a very ancient strategy. The Soviets used it, the USSR used it, but even the Mongols used it. Genghis Khan, the great conqueror, used the similar tactics and strategies. Even while hunting, the Mongols would do that. They would encircle a piece of woods or forest, and then they would trap a number of animals in there, and then they would hunt them as they wished. So this is a very old strategy, and that's what the Russian armed forces are using today. And so what we see is that there is no question of any underestimation, or the media will portray things in a way, in a variety of ways. If we look at social media, then one could conclude, or one could say that Ukraine is winning the war on social media, but on the ground there's a whole different reality which we are seeing through the maps. So that's just what it is. That's just how the campaign is progressing. Sapna says, this video did not age well. A lot of civilians have lost their lives. And Nitin said, you said there will be no harm to civilians, but people are dying, including Indians. What's your take on this? Okay. So last week I had said, when on day 2 or day 3 of the intervention, I had said that the Russians will try their best not to target civilians. They will try not to harm any civilians. That's what I said. And now people have interpreted that as me having said that not a single civilian will die. That's not what I said. In a military conflict, even if you try your best not to cause any civilian casualties, when the opposition is arming civilians, when they are placing hostages as human shields in military installations, you're going to have loss of life. I never said not a single civilian will die. That's impossible in a conflict. I said the Russians will try their best to minimize civilian casualties. They will not go and target civilians. They will only target military installations. And that is precisely what we have seen over the past 10 days. They are doing pinpoint strikes. They are targeting only military installations. They are not targeting civilians. Lots of videos are there when civilians are confronting the Russian soldiers who are carrying weapons, and the Russians are being very patient and very restrained. Right? So they are not targeting civilians. Yes, civilians will die if the Ukrainians place civilians as human shields inside military installations. We know that's happening. And if a civilian goes for a walk when there's a artillery barrage happening, that civilian will die if they're that's stupid, right? So casualties happen in war. If you compare the number of casualties that you saw in the American invasion of Iraq first 10 days and this particular Russian military campaign, the difference in civilian casualties will be shockingly different. There are very few civilian casualties in this campaign compared to what the Americans did in Iraq or in Afghanistan or in Libya or anywhere else in the last 20, 30, 50, 100 years. So that's what I meant, and that is precisely what's happening. And I never said there will be no harm to civilians. I said the Russians will try to minimize civilian casualties. They will do their best not to hurt any civilian. But this is war, man. Some people unfortunately will die. That is the sad thing about wars. Some people start the war, and the people who end up suffering the most are the innocent civilians. That's what happens always in wars. So the Russians are trying their best not to do that because they do not see the Ukrainians as a separate people, as a foreign nation. The Ukrainians are the same as the Russian people. They are Slavic people, and so on. I've gone into the history in the past. So that's the reason why the Russians are trying their best to minimize civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure. Okay, nobody gonna talk about Naveen who got direct shot from the Russian army, according to whatever. Dungar Singh Chauhan said, "You said the Russians will never kill any country's citizens, but our student is dead in the shelling of the Russian army." And Ajay says, "An Indian is already killed. You were saying in your videos that Russian military have no intention of harming civilians." Okay, so this is along the same themes as what the previous question I took. I never said. So there are two questions being asked over here. There's a specific question and a more general question. Okay, about Naveen. So we had this Indian student, very unfortunate, very tragic. Naveen Shekharappa, I think his name was. The death was announced on 1st of March, I believe. So he died in the city of Kharkiv. And initially it was believed that he died in shelling, but later it emerged through video evidence that he was shot. Somebody shot him. All right. Now, when Naveen was shot in Kharkiv, the Russians were not in Kharkiv. The Russians were outside Kharkiv, far away, many, many kilometers away. There was not a single Russian soldier in Kharkiv. And yet Naveen was shot to death. Now we know that in Kharkiv, the Ukrainians had been arming civilians. The Ukrainian government had issued AK-47s and other weapons to civilians. They had also freed criminals and given them weapons. Now, what can you put two and two together to understand what happened to our guy Naveen? The poor guy was in a bunker, in a bomb shelter all night. Then once the curfew was lifted for a few hours, he went out to get some provisions, some food and water, I suppose. And then we find that he has been shot. And there was not a single Russian in the city. Who is to be held responsible for this? The Russians? Come on. He was shot clearly not by a Russian. So who else can it be? Somebody on the Ukrainian side, either a civilian who had been given weapons or a criminal who was released by the Ukrainian government. That's all I can say. Right. Now, I did say the Russians will never willingly or knowingly hurt an Indian citizen. They will do their best to evacuate the Indian citizens. That's what I said. But this is war. I also said the Russians will try their best not to hurt civilians. But this is war. Bullets don't look at your nationality. Right. An artillery shell follows the laws of physics. It is not a magic shell that will see, oh, this person is not Ukrainian or this person is not a soldier, so don't hurt the person. No, that's not how it works. So when war happens, when there is shelling going on, Sometimes civilians will get hit, especially if the Ukrainian government is putting them as human shields, which they have been doing. And sometimes the shells will go in the wrong direction. Sometimes there will be crossfire, which will be uncontrolled when two sides are firing at each other. If civilians are caught in the crossfire, they will die. So please understand, people, use some logic. Please use some logic. Please use some common sense. Hmm? I have never said not a single civilian will die. I said the Russians will try their best to minimize civilian casualties. They will try their best to minimize damage to Ukrainian infrastructure, and they will never ever willingly hurt an Indian citizen. Okay, but if an Indian citizen gets caught in some crossfire, that in that case we will have a tragic loss of life. I hope it doesn't happen. Please, I wish and I hope it doesn't happen. And so far the Indian government is doing a very good job of evacuating the citizens. I hope it is concluded successfully. But this is war, so you may have casualties. I hope it doesn't happen, but that's how it goes. So I hope that clarifies what I said, and I hope that people will use a little bit more common sense while understanding things. Okay, Swastika says Russia is claiming that Ukraine has taken Indian students as hostages and using them as human shields. You can see blatant racism happening in Ukraine. MEA rejected both claims. What do you think is actually happening? How can India save its students? Harsh says, am I biased for thinking Ukraine did absolutely nothing to stop the war and all that? They are threatening India holding its students hostage. I don't see, and so on. Right. So last week I had shown the video of the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Nations speaking directly to the Indian ambassador and issuing a veiled threat to the Indian students who were in Ukraine. And I have got a lot of flack for that. People are saying you have misinterpreted the words because he did not say clearly that we are threatening students. Obviously, he's a diplomat. He will use diplomatic language, especially when he's making a public threat. He will use language that can be interpreted in a multiple number of ways. But the threat was unmistakable. And whatever he threatened us with, they have actually done it. We know that they have been preventing Indian students from leaving various cities, not allowing Indian students to board trains. Also, non-Indian foreigners like Africans, especially, they have been extremely racist. And it's not one or two instances; it's a pattern. It's a big pattern of racism against Indians, against Africans, and again even against the Greek people. Some Greek students, I believe. That's what I heard yesterday or today, that even Greeks were being subjected to racism. So Greek people, as you know, are not exactly white. They are kind of brown, light brown. So there's racism there also. And we know that Indians have been kept in various cities against their will. So that is called using people as human shields, right? So that is precisely what this individual, this thug, the Ukrainian ambassador, threatened India with, and that's precisely what's happened. So I said this on day 2 or day 3 of the war, right? And today, what I said has been we have seen it in action. That's what they did. So they have been using Indian students as hostages. They have been using Indian students as human shields, right? And racism also, as we know, it's happening. So that's what the Ukrainians have done. Even the BBC, which is so blatantly and so consistently anti-India, even the BBC has been forced to report about this, about the racism that Indians are facing. Indian students are being beaten up by Ukrainian police. Even girls are being beaten up by Ukrainian police. Our students are not being allowed to board, are not being allowed to get on trains, on buses. So what else do you see except for what I had said that they are doing? They're using Indians as hostages and human shields. That's precisely what we have seen. And by now, I hope that most of the Indians must have been evacuated. The Russians are also getting involved now because they are controlling large parts of the country. So I think a couple of days ago, about 48 hours ago, they stopped the war for about 6 hours and allowed Indians to be evacuated. Now the MEA, India's Ministry of External Affairs, is still trying to keep the situation calm. It is saying we don't know anything about human shields and hostages. That's what you say. When your people are held as hostages, you will try your best not to antagonize the hostage takers. You will say, no, no, kuch nahi ho raha hai. Everything is fine. They are very civilized. You will say that until you get your people out, right? So our people, our students are still in Ukraine. I think out of the 20,000 approximately students, at least 18,000 have been evacuated, but around 2,000 may still be there. I don't know what is the situation right now as we speak. I hope more have been evacuated. But as long as even one student or one citizen is there on Ukrainian soil, the MEA will try to keep things very conciliatory and not try to and try their best not to offend the Ukrainians, because the lives of our citizens are at stake. Once everything is over, we will issue whatever statement, whichever factual statement we need to issue. Okay, Rahul says the unbiased news channels keep blaming Russia for their unprovoked attack on a sovereign nation, and that nothing can justify this. Do Putin's actions violate the Budapest memorandum, that they would respect the sovereignty of Ukraine? And does it mean that treaties and agreements amount to nothing in today's world? And Quinn Reverence says Indians are in no place to criticize sensible and restrained US foreign policy. I love that. Sensible and restrained US foreign policy. If the US got militarily involved in Europe, it would start a world war. Then you'd be calling the US an aggressor, an escalator. If the US does nothing, then you will scold it on your high horse. If the US did anything more, you would scold it again, and so on and so forth. So until India has a clear position, sit down. This is what this most likely American gentleman is saying: sensible and restrained foreign policy. Okay, first of all, when it comes to treaties and agreements, remember the Iranians and the Americans, etc., and some other countries, that they had the Iran nuclear deal, an agreement that was signed and ratified, and the Americans just walked away from it, right? They tore the treaty into pieces. So whenever they want, they can tear a treaty into pieces. They can tear it to shreds. They can walk away from a treaty unilaterally. So then, what is the meaning of a treaty in today's world? Zero, right? The Chinese had this treaty with the UK, that they would have one country, two systems with respect to Hong Kong. They walked away from the treaty unilaterally. So this is how it works. When you are strong, you can do whatever you like. You can set the rules, you can break the rules. When you are weak, you have to follow the rules. You have to obey the rules which are set by the strong. The strong powers will keep changing the rules whenever they wish, as they wish, to suit themselves. And the weak countries have to keep following the rules even when the rules keep changing. That is the way geopolitics works. That's the way the world works. So treaties and agreements actually mean nothing. The strong countries can change the set of rules anytime they want. They can break a treaty anytime they wish. Right now, they have been saying that the Russian attack, the Russian intervention in Ukraine, has been an unprovoked attack. Right. So let's understand. Do we have a map somewhere? Let's take a look at the map. Yeah, it's always nice to see the map. So let me share the map with you in order to explain what is happening. Where's the map? Where's the map? Here's the map. Let me remove the question and let's take a look at the map. So this is the map. Now let's take a look at Europe. So there is this organization or coalition or whatever you want to call it, called NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is essentially led by the US. All right. And in 1990, until 1990, NATO had 16 members, mostly nations that are in Western Europe. Okay, Western Europe, UK, France, Germany, and so on and so forth. These were members of NATO. The objective of NATO was to counterbalance the USSR. So it was an anti-USSR military alliance. That's what NATO was. Until 1990, NATO had 16 members. In February 1990, the then USSR facilitated the reunification of East and West Germany in exchange for an American guarantee that NATO would not expand even 1 inch eastward. Okay, so this guarantee was issued to the USSR by the Americans in February 1990. And the German reunification happened, the USSR broke up, and the successor state was Russia, to whom the guarantee still applied. In 1999, Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic became members of NATO. So the promise was broken, the guarantee was broken. In 2004, another bunch of countries, Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, this entire bunch of countries became part of NATO. Again, the promise was broken. In 2009, Albania and Croatia became members of NATO. In 2017, Montenegro and North Macedonia became members of NATO. And now we have countries like Bosnia Herzegovina, Georgia, Ukraine that have been promised NATO membership. Ukraine, especially, becomes a very big problem because it is right on the doorstep of Russia, right, and other countries too. So what it essentially means is that you will have US nuclear weapons on Russia's doorstep. Now imagine if Russia were to place Russian nuclear weapons in Canada and in Mexico on American borders, on the American border, or in Cuba, which happened in the 1960s. How would the Americans react? Violently. But it's okay for them to do it on the Russian threshold, to essentially encircle Russia. So these are deliberate, repeated provocations by NATO, by the US, and eventually it became too much for Russia to ignore, because that would essentially put them at enormous threat, right? So Mr. Putin, in the initial days of his tenure as the president of Russia, he had even considered applying for NATO membership. It did not work out, and you can see what has been the consequences of subsequent developments. Right. So when you talk about what was the term this gentleman used? The sensible and restrained foreign policy. Are you kidding? Sensible and restrained foreign policy. Are you kidding? Who are you kidding? This is incredibly provocative foreign policy, right? That the and when you talk about restraint and all that, where was the restraint in Baghdad? Where was the restraint in Iraq? How many people died as a result of the US invasion of Iraq? At least 2 million. How many innocent Afghans died? At least 100,000, I would say. I don't have the exact numbers, you can look it up, but very large numbers. How many innocent civilians died in Libya? At least 10,000 minimum. So you call this sensible and restrained foreign policy? Who are you guys kidding? Right. So that's what I can say. That's the information that is available everywhere. This is well known. I mean, there's no controversy here. These are just facts. So it all depends on when you start your clock. See, the way you look at history depends on what time period, what slice of time you're looking at. If you start your clock in late February 2022, then it looks like the Russians have suddenly launched an unprovoked attack on Ukraine, right? That's how it looks. But then if you go back to 2014, then you will see that the Americans have effected an illegal, unconstitutional regime change in Ukraine and installed a puppet government. So if you start the clock in 2014, that's what you see. If you start the clock in 1991 or 1990, when the Americans gave a guarantee that they would not expand NATO, and then it was broken repeatedly, then you will see a whole different picture. And if you go back further in time, and I've spoken about the history of the Slavic people and the Russian people, you will see that Ukraine is an artificial nation. It has never, it's always been Russian territory throughout history, throughout the past 1,000 years, since the beginning of the history of the Kievan Rus people, right? With Prince Rurik, Prince Oleg, Prince Volodymyr, and so on and so forth. So in one of the previous live streams I've given, I've gone into the details of this history. If you can you can look it up. So if you want to have a very narrow, myopic view of history, then it will look like Russians have launched an unprovoked attack on Ukraine. But if you look at the proper context, you will understand that there are reasons why this happened. The Russians were backed into a corner, and they were given no choice at the end. When all the options ran out, they had to do this. So that's what the facts tell us. Okay, next question. Sultan Verma says, as you said, the war was necessary for Russia. I had a debate on this with my elder brother. He was saying if Russia had kept the army at the border, the pressure would be the same on Ukraine. What would be the other scenario if the Russians kept their army at the border? And the other question is, how will Putin justify to Russians the invasion was inevitable? Putin is solely blamed as if it was his madness to invade Ukraine. Was war the only solution? Okay, so let's say the first question is, what if the Russians had only kept the army at the borders? Then would all the problems be resolved? No. Then Ukraine would have a legitimate reason for joining NATO, and the Americans would have sent troops, and maybe further provocations would have ensued, and the regime would not have changed in Ukraine. The regime that was illegally, illegitimately, unconstitutionally put in place in 2014 in the NATO-led coup would have stayed in place, and therefore the objective, which is regime change, would never have been achieved. It's still not achieved as of today, 10 days into the intervention, but I suppose it will happen in the next 10 days or so. So yes, so going to war was necessary in order to effect the regime change, and in order to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Without the military intervention, those things would not have happened. It's still a work in progress. But yes, so the war was necessary. Just keeping the army on the borders of Ukraine would not have solved these problems that Mr. Putin seeks to resolve. Right? So the regime change would not have happened. Ukraine would not have been demilitarized, and Ukraine would certainly not have been denazified. So those three objectives could never have been achieved by keeping the Russian army on the borders of Ukraine. It needed a proper military intervention. Now, the other question is, was war the only solution? How will Putin justify to the Russians that the invasion was inevitable? I just laid out the entire history of the matter. The Russians were given a guarantee by the Americans in February 1990 that NATO would not expand a single inch eastward, and they have broken that guarantee repeatedly. 1999, 2004, 2009, 2017, and then in 2021, 22, again the provocations continued. Ukraine could have become a member of NATO. Bosnia Herzegovina and Georgia also. These are incredibly grave provocations. They are encircling Russia. This is this essentially is a matter of life and death for Russia at this point. So the invasion, the military intervention can be justified, can be clearly justified if you put it into the right context, in the context of the never-ending eastward expansion of NATO in breach of the guarantee that the Russians were given. So that justifies what Mr. Putin has done. That's the Russian view. Devansh says, why 90% of the Western media is showing that Putin is doing what Putin is doing is completely wrong. They're portraying him as a sinister villain. People in Russia are also protesting, even though it's their own national interest. See, there is a whole propaganda war that is fought in addition to the war that's fought on the ground, and the propaganda war is fought on social media with the various establishment mainstream media outlets: Washington Post, New York Times, the British BBC, the Guardian, and all the various NATO member countries, whatever outlets they have, whether it is German outlets or French outlets or whatever. So there's this whole propaganda war that is fought to keep up the morale of the people and to make them feel that the Ukrainians are winning or whatever. And in order to justify the sanctions you're imposing on Russia and whatever future actions you want to take against Russia, you have to portray them as evil, as villains, and you have to portray their leader, Mr. Putin, as a crazy madman. He's gone mad. He's gone completely mad. They're comparing him with Adolf Hitler these days, right? They are even comparing him with Genghis Khan. They are saying that he's Asian now. He is so bad that he's not even European anymore. He's Asian. So it's all about demonizing somebody. When you demonize somebody, it makes it very easy for you to uh, to do any kind of further action that you want against them. So if you want to brutalize a country, you have to first demonize it. If you want to oppress a certain class of people, you have to first demonize them. That is classic Marxist strategy. It is textbook Marxist strategy, right? Collective guilt. So that's a whole different story, but that's the reason why it is being done. So they are portraying Mr. Putin as a Hitler-like person or a Genghis Khan-like person, as a crazy madman. He's gone mad. He's completely unrestrained. He's lost his marbles. That's what they're doing. So that is going to lay the groundwork for and the justification for any action they take in the future. That's what is happening. Chiching says we can see that most of the civilians of Ukraine, old and young, are joining the military to stop the Russian troops. Is this a sign that Russia may lose the war? So you are right, Chiching. The I would not say all of them or most of them are joining the war effort, but the Ukrainian government has released lots of prisoners, criminals, and given them weapons. They are also issuing AK-47s and various other rifles, automatic rifles, machine guns, Molotov cocktails, bombs, etc., to civilians. Right. So they are doing that too. Now, let's understand what this means. The job of defending the country is that of the professional armed forces. It is their job to do it. Now, when you are forced to start arming your civilians, what does it mean? It means that your professional armed forces are no longer able to do their job of defending the country, and therefore civilians need to be enlisted. So it actually is an act of utter desperation if you are forced to start arming the civilians. It means that you are losing the war. It doesn't mean the Russians are losing the war. It means the Ukrainians are desperate. They may lose the war. And the other reason why they are arming civilians, it's a very cynical thing to do, is to have more civilian casualties. See, if the Russians have been instructed not to deliberately harm any civilians, and we are seeing the evidence of that on lots of video clips that are circulating. They are not harming civilians in the face of all kinds of protests and provocations. But imagine the Russian soldiers come face to face with a person who's holding a gun. In that case, they have to treat that person as an enemy combatant. They have no other option. When a professionally trained soldier comes face to face with a person holding a weapon, they are compelled to treat that person as an enemy combatant. And then what will happen is you will have civilian casualties. And that is great for media propaganda. The Russians are killing civilians. There are so many civilians who died. So that is a very cynical and sinister and diabolical thing to do, to arm civilians who have no training in using weapons. You can't learn how to use an AK-47 with half an hour or 2 days of training. You need a proper training course that lasts weeks. Okay, these weapons are extremely dangerous things. You can hurt yourself, you can hurt the civilian population if you don't know how to use it. And you can't learn how to use it in half an hour or even 2 days. So that's what's happening. So if civilians are joining the war effort, it means that the Ukrainians are desperate and they are losing, and they are trying to create unnecessary civilian casualties in order to win the propaganda war. Ahan says, do you think Vladimir Putin will make Viktor Yanukovych as the new president of Ukraine? And also, why has, apart from Russia, not a single country criticized the genocide in Donbass? So, it doesn't matter who is installed as the new president of Ukraine. It will be somebody who will be favorably disposed towards Russia. It could be Mr. Yanukovych or some other puppet president. There's no other way of looking at it. It's going to be a puppet. It's going to be a person who will be absolutely 100% loyal to Mr. Putin. That's just how it goes. That is the brutal truth of geopolitics. Right? You install puppet governments. So the other question is, apart from Russia, why has nobody criticized the genocide in Donbass? That has not been reported at all. There has been a war going on in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine since 2014. And there have been all kinds of atrocities that have been perpetrated on the Russian-speaking people of this region by various Ukrainian armed militias, whether it's the regular armed forces or the various neo-Nazi militias. And yeah, you could consider it to be genocide, definitely. And the West has deliberately ignored that. The West has a track record of selectively reporting things and selectively ignoring certain things. We know what's been happening in Tibet since the 1950s. A proper genocide. Does the West ever talk about it? They talk about the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are very convenient these days as a stick to beat China with. But why has the West never spoken about Tibet? Because it doesn't want to. Why does the West not speak about the genocide that's happening in Yemen right now? Who is doing it, by the way? Find out. There's a genocide happening in Yemen right now. Civilians are being bombarded from the skies, and they don't speak about it. Most of you may not even know about the fact that this is happening right now as we speak. Right. And similarly, the genocide in Donbass has never been reported upon. Nobody even knows that it happened. So, this is the true face of the Western media, the mainstream media, even the Indian media, by the way. All right. So, there are certain Indian news channels that are these days they are reporting the Ukraine war 24 by 7, right? There are two or three channels that are doing that. Unfortunately, I will not take names of the names of the channels, but the reporting is from a Western perspective. It's not from the Indian perspective. It is completely biased towards the NATO perspective. So we don't have an Indian perspective at all in the Indian media. They are simply puppets of the West. That's what we are seeing. Some of these media channels, I am told, are trying to tone down that very visible tilt towards the West and try to be a little bit more balanced, but it's not really working. So that's what you see, right? So that's the truth about the media. They will report. Their reporting is biased. It is selective, and they omit whatever is not convenient. Herschel says Mr. Putin has already ordered to activate the nuclear command. If it really happens, then how will the world react, and so on. And reports came out that Russia already used a vacuum bomb, which is a violation of the Geneva Convention. Again, these so-called reports come out on social media in various Western media outlets. What is the evidence that the Russians used a vacuum bomb? It's called a thermobaric bomb, by the way. Okay, so what's the evidence the Russians have used this sort of weapon? There's no evidence beyond the claims, the empty claims made by various propaganda outlets. There is no verifiable evidence that this sort of weapon has been used, which is a violation of whatever convention, Geneva Convention or whatever, right? So there's no evidence. It's just wild claims that they are making to further demonize the Russians. They also made claims of the Russians using cluster bombs, cluster weapons, which again is completely unproven. Now, the Americans, the NATO people, the NATO armed forces used cluster bombs, cluster munitions during their genocide, or let's call it intervention or liberation of Yugoslavia, in Albania, in Kosovo. Civilians, lots and lots of civilians died in that. Lots of people lost limbs in that. What happened to the Geneva Convention there? Or maybe at that time, cluster munitions were not part of the Geneva Convention. I'm not really sure what exactly it is, but we know for a fact there is documentary evidence, horrific images. I will not share them here, but it's known they use cluster weapons, cluster munitions on civilians. So when they do it, it's fine. When Russians do it, even though we don't have any evidence they've done it, then it's bad. So the same things they have done, do you want to accuse the Russians of doing it and then demonize them? Look at the hypocrisy, right? As far as the nuclear command goes, Mr. Putin has ordered them to be on high alert, which is just a way of telling the West, stay away. He obviously nobody wants to use nuclear weapons unless there is no, unless you have run out of options. Well, the Russians have not by any means run out of any options. It's just a way of telling the US and NATO, stay back. We are serious. We're not messing around here. That's all it is. Priyanka says, while Russia continues attacking Ukraine, destroying cities one by one, lots of people, lots of countries around the world are putting sanctions against it, and various companies are terminating businesses with them. How long could it take for either country to give up? Okay, Priyanka, I'm wondering which city has been destroyed. See, the thing is this. Even in the Indian media, they will have this. I remember during the so-called anti-CAA protests, there was this one protest that was going on. Like 15 people were protesting with some placards and banners, and there, these drums, and they were playing the drums and all that. So 15 people are protesting, and there are 50 cameras around them, and they are portraying this as a nationwide protest. They manufactured this entire narrative in this manner. 15-20 people protesting somewhere and 50 cameras around them, and all the media channels are reporting it 24 by 7. as if some huge protest is happening throughout the country. These were all artificial, astroturfed protests, but they were portrayed as nationwide spontaneous protests. Now, once again, in Ukraine, we are seeing these various reports, various clips on the internet, on social media, of this building destroyed here and that building destroyed there, and some city block that is damaged and all that. And these selective clips are being used to portray, to create the impression that the Russians are destroying entire cities. That is simply not the case. The Russians are doing their best not to damage any civilian infrastructure. The electricity is still running everywhere. The internet is still running everywhere. All telecommunications are working fine. Buses are plying. Trains are running. So there is no, I mean, it's a complete lie that the Russians are destroying cities one by one. Not a single city has been destroyed. Yeah, there has been some damage to some buildings. They've taken out certain buildings with targeted strikes, such as one of the buildings in which the Azov neo-Nazi division had their headquarters. That was taken out. And in case the Ukrainians are shelling the Russians from within an apartment complex, they will have to retaliate, right? So some damage will happen, but they are by no means destroying cities one by one. That's simply not the case. But that's the impression they are trying to create on social media and in the mainstream media. So these are just lies. It's just propaganda. It is designed to turn people's opinion against Russia and in favor of NATO. That's just the propaganda war that we are witnessing, and it's very easy to mislead people by with this. Now the sanctions and all that, various companies terminating business. How long will it take for either country to give up? The Ukrainians, see, I foresee the military objectives of the Russian intervention being met within the next 10 days. That's what I foresee. So today is the 5th of March. Foresee, I believe that by the 15th of March, most of the military objectives of the Russian intervention in Ukraine will be achieved. That's what I think. I know it's a fool's errand to make predictions, but let me just put a prediction out there. I know how it feels. I know, I have experienced this myself firsthand, that I make a prediction and then I look foolish. But here, let me go again. So I think in the next 10 days, the military objectives will be achieved. Now the sanctions have been put on Russia. We know that they've dumped every possible sanction on Russia. They've essentially given Russia nothing more to lose. That's what they've done, right? So they have essentially told Putin that no matter, I mean, you can now go and conquer Poland if you want, and there's no more sanctions we can throw on you because we've already thrown everything at you, the entire kitchen sink. And Russia is not going to give up because of the sanctions. Mr. Putin has been planning this, I believe, since for at least 10 years, right? So it was not done 10 years ago because the right pieces on the chessboard were not in place. So the planning an invasion like this, an operation like this, takes time. It has to be done meticulously. So I believe the planning has been in progress for at least 10 years. So all of these steps that the Western nations have taken, that the US has taken essentially, have been foreseen. All of these things would have been calculated and taken into account when looking at the pros and cons of launching an operation like this. So there is no surprise that Mr. Putin is faced. He would have known that all these sanctions would be placed on Russia. The SWIFT thing would be cut off and whatever else. So he has anticipated this. He's prepared for it. And there's a bigger reconfiguration of the world order that is in process right now. How should Russia counter the fake news and one-sided reporting favoring Ukraine? The social media, popular news channels are largely under the influence of the NATO countries, especially the US. Failure to do so may lead to massive civil protests and so on and so forth. So, how should Russia counter the fake news? The Russians are already countering the fake news. They have banned Facebook. They have blocked access to Facebook in Russia, and they may go ahead and do the same with other social media channels, outlets as well. Instagram, Twitter, whatever else, right? So They can do it. The Chinese have their own firewall, the Great Firewall of China, and they don't allow any US social media to make its way into China. We know that the Chinese citizens use VPN to bypass these restrictions, and the Chinese government kind of tolerates it to some extent, but they could also crack down on such violations. So the Russians have banned Facebook. They may soon ban BBC, CNN, all of those media networks as well. So these are some of the ways in which the Russians can do it. And the thing is that the Russian citizens are not that easy to mislead. Okay, this is interesting. So the question is, what Anurag says, what impact of this war will be on India? We saw many Western diplomats are unhappy with the Indian decision to abstain from voting at the UN Security Council. Tejas says, why did no one condemn US and NATO for abandoning Ukraine, but everybody is showing their discomfort and displeasure at India not supporting Ukraine? When did we become so important for them? And Anonymous says, what will be the consequences for India after this war, as the West is pissed off with us? And how should we prepare for it? Very good questions. So the question is, why is the West suddenly blaming India? And what are the consequences? What is going to be the impact of all of this on India? Very good question. Let me share my screen. And one second. So let's take a look at what the chatter is on social media. So various commentators, diplomats, think tank experts, analysts, etc., from the West are chattering on social media and putting out this message about India. So this is a guy called Robert Shrimsley. He's saying India's abstention is a useful wake-up call to those in the West talking it up as part of the alliance of democratic countries they want to build. So he is saying India is not a democratic country. It's a wake-up call for the West. Edward Luce says, whatever the calculations, misplaced loyalties, etc., India is at risk of abdicating its respect as one of the world's leading democracies. So he's saying India is losing respect. This individual, Derek Grossman, says India abstains again. Icky stuff, really icky stuff. So India is icky now, not clean, dirty. Uh, Anne Applebaum says it is shameful that India abstained. And somebody else says that in India in particular is going to have to face some extremely tough reprisals from the West. You don't get to do this and then ask for Western support when Pakistan messes in Kashmir or China encroaches on the northern border. This guy says that India and Pakistan should hang their heads in shame and not receive a single penny piece in aid from the UK. As if they are giving us any aid. They have stolen trillions of dollars worth of money from us, but they're talking about so-called aid. Alex Wickham says Western leaders are furious at Modi over his support for Putin. Jeff Smith says that I can't sympathize with Indian commentators gleefully spouting Russian propaganda and cheering on Putin. You took the wrong pill, comrades. Bruno, the great Bruno, says India fully aligning with Russia. It's a great blemish for the country, for India. Again, Bruno says that a question was very simple, but Dr. S. Jaishankar stumbled and mumbled. I guess we now know that for India, territorial integrity is something that applies only to India. So that sort of chatter is going on in the West, and there's a reason for this. They are trying to portray India as a country that is undemocratic. It is a fascist country, and it is a country that supports military aggression, and a country that supports Russia. It doesn't support democracy. It's an undemocratic, fascist, evil, oppressive, and all that kind of country. That's the impression they are trying to create on social media. What is the reason for that? They are building the justification for not supporting India in the future. In supporting India in what? Supporting India against a future Chinese aggression. The Americans are anticipating that China is going to attack India in some way in the coming future, not very far future, coming future. See, everyone believes that the Chinese will try to take Taiwan right now. That's not going to happen. Taiwan is too big a problem for them right now. They are not in a position to take Taiwan because the Taiwanese are well prepared, and it will be a red line the Americans will not allow the Chinese to cross. So what can China do? China can attack India, and the Americans are anticipating that, and they don't want to get involved in this. They don't want to help India. So right now they are creating the groundwork. They are they are laying the groundwork on social media. They are creating the justification for their people, for the citizens. Because see, if China attacks democratic India and the Americans don't help India, it looks bad. Because America always talks about democracy, democracy, democracy. And India is the world's biggest democracy. So democracies are supposed to help each other. And if the Americans don't do it, the public may not like it. So they are now trying to portray India as an undemocratic, fascist, evil, oppressive, icky kind of country. So that's what we are seeing on social media right now. So it looks like the Americans are anticipating a conflict between India and China soon. So that's what I had tweeted recently. Like like yesterday, I said that India needs to prepare for a short, sharp 1962 like conflict with China. Could happen before 24 or in 2024. The objective would be to inflict a military defeat on India, to break off the northeast, to cut off India's access to its northeast, and that would cause the current government of Prime Minister Modi to lose the 2024 election. If you lose a big piece of territory, the people will vote you out of power, right? And all indications are that the US anticipates this. India must be ready. That's what I said. And in response to that, Velina Chakarova, who has appeared on my podcast on this channel, she said that she anticipates military tensions between China and India ahead of September 2022, as Xi Jinping is dedicated to solidifying his power and will need the strong support of his military hawks to do that. Taiwan is not an option, so it will likely affect India. So she anticipates some sort of conflict before September this year. I said it will happen before or in 2024. And it looks like the Chinese desire regime change in India. And even the Americans seem to desire regime change in India. Nobody wants a strong, assertive government in India. They want a weak, pliable government in India. And Narendra Modi's government is not a weak and pliable government. So the Americans don't want that. Even the Chinese don't want that. So it's a paradox that the Americans and Chinese both seem to desire a change of government, a change of regime in India. And the best way to do that would be for China to attack India, break off a part of India's territory, and that would be a humiliation for India like 1962, and the government will lose power in the next elections. So that seems to be what we are witnessing right now. And because of that, to prepare the groundwork and the justification for not helping India, we are seeing all of this big campaign on social media, whose objective is to demonize India as an undemocratic, fascist, evil country. That's what we're witnessing. So we need to be prepared. India needs to be prepared for a conflict with China in the short to medium term. Okay, so the logical question to that is, will Russia help India if China starts a war? And what's the probability of India defeating China? Vidish says, if there's a war between India and China or India Pakistan, will the Russians support us by any means? Vansh says, can the Chinese also do the same to us? What Russia is doing with Ukraine? As China supposedly has entered parts of Arunachal Pradesh, can China do the same with us? So in the current scenario, in the current situation, the Russians are in no position to help India if there is a conflict between India and China. They are not in a position to do that. They are not strong enough to do that. They need the support of the Chinese, especially the financial support. They are trying to create a different global order. So the world is becoming more and more bipolar right now. So they are trying to create a different system, and they're trying to break free of the American system. So the Russians and the Chinese need each other's support. So if there is a war between India and China, the Russians are not in a position to help India. The question also is that, can the Chinese do the same to us, what Russia is doing with Ukraine? So is India prepared for this eventuality of a short, sharp 1962 like war with China? I believe India is very well prepared for that. I think it would be really foolish for the Chinese to believe that they can indulge in some sort of misadventure with India. If they were to do it, they would most likely aim for the Siliguri corridor, the chicken's neck, which connects the far east of India, which we call the northeast, with the so-called mainland of India. So the Chinese may try to aim for that and try to cut that off. So, can the Chinese succeed in that? I think it would be really stupid of the Chinese to try such a thing, because I think India is really well prepared. If the Chinese do that, India can take the fight into Chinese occupied Tibet territory. India can take out all the Chinese military bases. We have the missiles that can do it. Our missiles are more or less unstoppable, and we can fire salvos of missiles. We can even send our fighter aircraft, and we have an advantage when it comes to the air force, because the Chinese air force in Tibet is the planes are stationed at a very high altitude, which means they can carry less fuel and less weaponry, whereas our planes can carry much more weaponry and much more fuel. So we have a significant advantage there, and I think India would anticipate this sort of potential misadventure from the Chinese. So I think India is very well prepared. I don't think the Chinese would succeed if they try this. They may end up losing more than they would gain, right? And it could end up essentially humiliating the Chinese leadership, which would be a disaster in China. The Chinese don't tolerate humiliation. Humiliation in a military encounter inevitably leads to regime change in China. So I think it would be playing with fire if the Chinese try that. I think India is very well prepared, and of course we have certain red lines the Chinese will not even dare to cross, because we have the ultimate weapon also. So I think India is reasonably well prepared, but we must never be complacent. We have to be well prepared at all times, especially now when things are changing really fast. Okay, Ankit Boy says the rule based world order and the international organizations, are they all myths of Western hegemony under the US? Events like the NATO intervention in the Kosovo war, Iraq invasion, and countless other events tell us that Western powers bend the rules according to their interests, and when somebody else does that, these countries and organizations become hyperactive. Kanchan says, please elaborate on all the incidents where the US invaded other nations in the name of liberation, and no international organization questioned their actions. Good question. I have some data here. So these are US interventions since the Second World War, from the 1940s all the way into the 2020s. China, Syria, Korea, China, Iran, Guatemala, Tibet, Indonesia, Cuba, Congo, Dominican Republic, Vietnam, so on and so forth. So many interventions. And yet it does not mention here the invasion of Yemen, the genocide that's happening in Yemen as we speak. It also doesn't talk about the US financing of Pakistani terrorism in India for 2 3 decades. It doesn't That is also not mentioned here. The Americans financed Pakistani terrorism in India from the 1980s onwards. We know what happened in Kashmir, right? The ethnic cleansing of the Kashmiri Hindus in 1989, 1991. So all of that was financed by the Americans. Who else was financing the Pakistanis? They were essentially saying that we are giving money to Pakistan and arms and ammunition to Pakistan to end terrorism in Pakistan and to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan. To defeat terrorists, you don't need to give a nation F-16s and fighter planes, but that's what they did. They always knew that these planes would be used against India, and they were fine with that. So the Americans financed Pakistani terrorism in India and so much more. So these are some of the interventions that the Americans have done across the world. So the so-called rules-based world order, it is a fairy tale. It's a myth. When they do it, it's perfectly fine. If somebody else does it, it's a terrible sin, and you need to dump sanctions on that country. So that's the thing, right? So when you are the most powerful country in the world, you make the rules and you break the rules whenever you feel, and nobody's going to question you. That's how it works. But now Now, things are changing. You can see on even the mainstream media channels, everybody is calling out the hypocrisy and the track record. Okay, next question. Rajpal says, funny, funny, funny. You still believe that the US will help Taiwan? The US is EU is only interested in selling arms. Japan needs to revise their policy. EU should be on alert. Abhijit Singh says there is no defense treaty between the US and Taiwan. US State Department has officially stated blah blah blah. It will give weapons to Taiwan defending itself. Understand something, my friends. The US cannot afford to lose Taiwan to the Chinese. The US simply can't afford to have that. If the Chinese gain Taiwan, it gives them access to the entire Indo Pacific. It will be the end of American hegemony in the Indo Pacific. That's what it means. It is a frontier that the Americans cannot afford to lose. They cannot afford to allow the Chinese to breach that frontier. The island chains. There are two island chains. If you look at the map, let's go and look at the map. One second. Not this. Sorry, not this. I have to bring in the map. Just a second. Here's the map. Let me remove the question so you can see it properly. This is the map. So there are two island chains. So one, so as you can see, the Chinese are encircled at sea. Over here, you have the Japanese islands. If you go down south, you have Okinawa and so on. Here you have Taiwan, and here you have the Philippines, Indonesia, and so on. So it is encircled by all these islands. And these islands, the forces that are stationed there are essentially not very friendly to the Chinese. The Japanese are essentially um, they are in they are under the US. There's no nice way of putting it. Japan is essentially under US occupation right now, right? It has been that way since the end of the Second World War. Taiwan is a de facto American client state. The Philippines have traditionally been very much pro US, and so on. So all of this entire island chain, it encircles China and keeps Chinese actions limited to a certain geographical territory of the ocean. So if the Chinese were to gain Taiwan, they would break free of these shackles, and they would be free to rule, if they can, the Indo-Pacific region. If Taiwan falls, they would also be free to make their way into the Indian Ocean and to outnumber the Indian army and possibly try to outmatch the Indian Navy in the Indian Ocean. So Taiwan is key to that. The Americans cannot afford to lose Taiwan, right? So no matter what you say that the Americans don't have a treaty or whatever, they will simply not allow the Chinese to take Taiwan. It is going to be a disaster for the US. It will be the end of America's superpower status if the Chinese succeed in conquering Taiwan. And that's why you will see that the Americans have significant amount of of presence of forces, of strength, of weapons and all that in on Taiwanese soil. So it is still not time. It is the Chinese are still not in a position to make a move on Taiwan, and that's why I was saying that they could try to make a move on India if they feel that they can get away with that. Okay, Spurs says the removal of certain Russian banks from SWIFT shows how the global interdependence can be weaponized by the West. Does this mean that India should invest more in self-reliant sources of fuel like solar, wind, hydro, etc.? As in the future, our dependence on the Middle East and others for oil and coal could also be weaponized. How else can we hedge risks to our energy security? Very good question. India needs to diversify its sources of energy. So buy fuel from as many countries as possible, diversify your portfolio. And as we know, even the UAE has abstained in this vote against the Russians during the current ongoing crisis. So the UAE has also abstained. So it's not playing per the American playbook. And India and the UAE have excellent relations. So that's one of the sources of our energy security. India and Saudi Arabia also have very good relations, and we should try and acquire other sources of energy as well. And like you said, we should also try and diversify into solar, wind, hydro, and all that. As of today, we need hydrocarbons. We need fossil fuels. You cannot fly a fighter jet based on solar energy, right? As of today, the technology still doesn't exist. If you have a navy, if you have submarines, you can have nuclear submarines for sure, but most of your vessels, your ships, are going to use fossil fuels. So and the entire automobile system and everything in India, most of it is based on fossil fuels, and that's the case all around the world right now. So as of right now, we need to ensure that we diversify our sources of fossil fuels. That's what we should do. And in the future, as as technologies evolve and get better, we can diversify in other things as well. So yes, you're right. We need to be mindful of this, that everything can be weaponized. The global financial system can be weaponized. The uh, fuels, energy can be weaponized. Everything can be weaponized, especially when you have one country controlling everything. So India needs to be mindful of that, and India needs to diversify as far as it can. Nishant says, can UPI replace Swift, as some countries have started adopting it? And Swastika says, can the Swift be replaced by India's UPI to counter Western economic hegemony? So what is Swift? Swift is a means of transferring money from one bank to another, from one country to another. It's essentially a private uh, company, I believe, that charges money for all the transactions that you do. So Swift can be replaced. It's not very hard to create a Swift like system in India, in China, in Russia, in some other country. The main problem is to get lots of other countries to adopt this system. That's the main thing. So right now, Swift is controlled by the West. When we say West, we essentially mean the US, and that's why they're able to cut off any country that they don't like from the system. So even without Swift, the Russians will be able to do financial transactions, but it will be an additional hardship, because Swift makes things very convenient. So India could create its own Swift, or the Chinese could create their own Swift like system. Or what about the UPI, right? The UPI is not exactly a Swift like system, it's a different kind of system, but you could enhance the UPI system and bring it into the kind of ability or capabilities that Swift has. It's certainly something India can do. The only thing is, how many countries can you get to adopt this system? And if you do that, obviously the Americans will not like it, because you're trying to create a parallel system. So India has to consider all these things. Right now, we are still not strong enough to stand up to the US. We are still a small $3 trillion economy, right? So India has to wait. India has to work hard. India has to bide its time. India has to right now keep its head down, not try and antagonize the big powers, and build up its economy to at least the level of $10 trillion. So the replacement for Swift can be created. It's not very hard to do that. Okay, Pragyesh says, as a data scientist, I can claim that creating a web browser environment is probably the most difficult IT task, as it requires huge resources. Given the current scenario of Ukraine, Russia, and the way Google and Apple have restricted Russian access, it is imperative that we create our own web browser and search engine as effective as Google. How can we make that happen? Is any government or private organization working on it? As far as I know, nobody seems to be working on such a thing. You are absolutely right. See, right now, I hear that Microsoft has announced that it will no longer support um, its operations in Russia. So Windows updates will not happen if you are in Russia, and if you have a Windows laptop or computer and so on and so forth. They're cutting off all support. So that could lead to problems, right? And so it is useful to have your own systems, your own infrastructure, your own, like you said, web browser environment, your own search engines and all that. The Chinese have done that. They have their own search engine, they have their own social media. The Russians also have their own search engine. I don't remember what it's called. They don't have their own social media, but they may not need it, or they may be in a position to develop it. So I think in the future, all big countries, all powerful countries, will become more and more mindful of the fact that these things can be weaponized, and all countries will start creating their own social media, their own search engine, and you will find the compartmentalization of the internet coming into the picture. The Chinese already have it, the so-called Great Firewall of China. In the future, any country that wishes to remain a sovereign nation may be forced to implement something like that, because it's very easy to manufacture public opinion using social media. Very easy. It's very easy to influence elections in a democratic country from abroad using social media, right? So it's a big problem. So I you're right, this is very important for India, especially if India wants to remain a sovereign nation, an independent nation in the third decade of the 21st century. So India needs to have its own search engine. India needs to have, I mean, there's nobody in India that manufactures laptops or computers, right? We are planning to become a big manufacturer of semiconductors and chips. It's still something that's just a plan. It's not been implemented yet. I hope it happens quickly in the next decade. So that will make India independent from other countries in that regard, in that respect. But it is also very important for India to have its own search engines, not one, multiple, and its own social media and all of that. Maybe its own operating system as well. So all of this needs to happen. As far as I know, I'm not aware of any private company or government organization that's doing it, but I hope it happens. So you have raised a very important point here. Okay, a bunch of questions about the win-lose scenarios. What happens to India if Russia wins? What happens to India's interests if Russia loses? Right? Um, so what happens in both cases is what all these questions are asking. Kamleshwar Jai Krishna Singh says, what will happen to India's geopolitical perspective if Russia wins or loses the war? Greetings from Amsterdam. Greetings, sir. And so on. So what happens? See, most likely Russia is winning no matter what they say on social media. As I showed you on the maps, Russia is most likely going to achieve its military objectives in the next 10 days. It looks like that. So if Russia wins, it secures its possession of Ukraine, then the global order changes, because the NATO will not be able to expand that far, and other countries may also be mindful of the power of Russia, and they may try to strike a balance between NATO and Russia, countries like Poland and the various Baltic republics and so on and so forth. So that would place Russia in a more powerful position. It would also bolster China's geopolitical ambitions, right? So what does it mean for India? See, the thing is this. Let's say Russia loses. They lose the war in Ukraine. They are beaten back. That sort of thing is terrible. Mr. Putin, if that happens, Mr. Putin may lose his presidency also. Somebody else may come into the picture, because Russians don't tolerate failure mostly. So Russia would then become a very weak country, crippled by sanctions and so on. In that case, it's bad for India. Why is that? Because India needs Russia as a counterweight to China. Right now, the Russians and the Chinese are cooperating, but let me assure you, it's not a long term cooperation. If you look at the map, you will see what I mean. Where's the map? Look at Russia and look at China. They have a very long shared border. And when you have a shared border and you are both powerful countries, that is geopolitical. I mean, that is a recipe for geopolitical conflict. When you have two powerful nations who have a long shared common border, there is going to erupt into conflict at some time or the other. So, in the long run, Russia and China are geopolitical adversaries. Right now, they are cooperating because it is convenient for them to cooperate. So, for India, it is good to have a strong Russia, a Russia that is beaten back, A Russia that is crippled is not good for India. And Russia is most likely going to achieve its objectives. In that case, the Chinese will also be bolstered because they are essentially using Russia as a mercenary force right now. So they are cooperating and coordinating with Russia, and they want to essentially create a separate, a parallel global system. A global system that is going to create a bipolar world. One will be the US dominated Western world, and the other will be the Eastern Bloc, Russia and China, and whoever else comes with that, comes into that orbit. So if Russia is stronger, if Russia succeeds, it may actually be good for India. It may give India leverage in negotiations with the US also. If Russia loses, then all the leverage is gone. So it's a complicated situation, but essentially a Russian victory in the long run on the geopolitical chessboard may actually be favorable for India. If Russia loses, India loses a lot of its leverage, and then India will have to go completely into the US orbit. And the US may impose lots of conditions on India. Okay, this is an interesting question. Lingua ex Deo says, didn't Genghis Khan have a rules based system? Are there exceptions? You said that he invaded countries only when his own country was wronged. Do you know what this is called? It's called having principles. Yes, I said that. However, you are correct that most countries do act in the manner that you described in the video. So it's like this. When Genghis Khan ruled over half the world, he was the superpower. The Mongol Empire was the superpower. And while he was alive, he ruled in a certain manner. He had, like you say, a rules based system. He had principles and he acted according to those principles. So he invaded countries only in retaliation, only when his own country was wronged. And that's the reason why he refused to invade India, even when he was on the doorstep of India, even though India was the wealthiest country in the world at the time. So he had a rule based system very clearly. He acted according to those principles. Today, those principles have been dispensed with. Mongolia is no longer a superpower. It's no longer even a small power. It's essentially insignificant today. Half of Mongolia is currently occupied by China. Today, the so called rules based system is based on the rules that the Americans set. And as we know, they keep on changing the rules as per their convenience. So that's just how it goes. The most powerful country, the biggest power, is going to set the rules. When it is somebody who has actual principles, the rules are going to be principled and they will be applied uniformly. When it is a power that is not that principled, you will have a system like the one that you have today. When they do it, it's fine. When somebody else does it, they need to be sanctioned. So that's just how it goes, and that's what we are witnessing. But it's a very interesting question you asked. I had not thought of it in that way, that Genghis Khan had a rules based system, but that's exactly what it is. It's a very interesting observation that you have made. Augusta said, I've heard you say and tweet that power is worth more than money when it comes to geopolitics. Why is it so? And could you explain it to us in layman's terms? Yes, I have said this multiple times, including in the Genghis Khan video, that power always trumps wealth. Power always trumps money. If you have money, then your money can always be taken away by somebody who is powerful. But if you are powerful, then nobody can take your money away from you. And if you're powerful, then you can use money to buy more power. But if you are just wealthy but not powerful, you cannot use that money to buy power. So that's how it works. So, how do I explain this in layman terms? So, in 1994, I believe there was the so called Budapest Protocol, Budapest Agreement. So what happened during the breakup of the USSR was that Ukraine had approximately 3,000 USSR nuclear warheads on its territory, on Ukrainian soil. So Ukraine became a separate country. The USSR was too weak to prevent the breakup of the country. So Ukraine became a separate country, an independent republic. It had 3,000 Soviet nuclear weapons on its soil, and it gave away those nuclear weapons, 3,000 nuclear weapons to Russia in exchange for a guarantee that the Russians would ensure that the USSR, that Ukraine would remain peaceful. So, in exchange for a guarantee of protection and peace, the Ukrainians gave away all their nuclear weapons, and this was guaranteed by the Russians, by the Americans, and by NATO. So there were three guarantors of Ukraine's security in exchange for giving away nuclear weapons. Now, do you know what nuclear weapons represent? They represent the ultimate power in the world. If you have one nuclear warhead, you are powerful. The Ukrainians had 3,000 nuclear warheads. That is an immense amount of power which they had in their hands, and they gave it away to the Russians. Imagine if they had even 30 nuclear warheads today. Would Mr. Putin have dared to invade Ukraine? That's what it is. That is why power is more important than money. The Ukrainians are wealthy. They are a resource rich country. They are a reasonably wealthy country. But that money is not going to save them from the invasion, right? But if they had the power which they gave up, then the invasion would never have happened. So you may be the wealthiest country in the world, like India was throughout its history. India accounted for over a third of the entire world's GDP. And when India had these powerful empires, nobody dared to invade. But in the past 1,000 years, because of political fragmentation, India was invaded successfully, slowly over time, and all the wealth was stolen out of India. So your wealth is of no use unless you are powerful. Unless you have the power and you know how to use it. Excuse me. So that illustrates the difference between power and wealth, and it shows you why power is always more important than wealth. Okay, Rahul says, what do you think of Vladimir Putin's leadership? He's made out to be the villain among the Westerners, but he's looking at his after his national interests. Excuse me. Are they justified to compare him with Hitler, who was a monster? How would you compare Putin's leadership qualities with Zelensky's? See, Mr. Zelensky is by profession an entertainer, an actor, and a comedian. You know, the ancient Romans said that entertainers should be kept far away from power. Entertainers should be kept far away from society. They should live separately, right? So that was the rule that the Romans had. And even Vishnugupta Chanakya in the Arthashastra, I think he mentions that entertainers should be taxed highly and kept separate from society. But today, in today's world, our biggest role models in today's society are entertainers, actors and actresses, and all that. And that's why people like Zelensky, because of their entertainment ability and acting ability, become successful politicians, even though they may not have the right kind of leadership ability. So Putin is not an entertainer. He's not a funny guy. I mean, sometimes he may be, but that's not his primary call to fame. So Putin is a genuine leader. Zelensky is just a puppet. He's a NATO puppet. He was put in place because he was popular as an entertainer, and that's how it went. So there is no comparison leadership. And today the media is trying to portray Zelensky as a very, very courageous figure wearing military uniform and not giving up and standing strong and giving wonderful speeches even though the Russians are invading. That is just media hype. That is not leadership. Leadership is not quantified in the kind of speeches you give, like Barack Obama. Leadership is all about actions, right? So, what do I think about Vladimir Putin's leadership? Well, he's doing whatever it takes to safeguard and promote his national interest, the interest of his nation. And the first principle of leadership, the non-negotiable quality a leader needs to have, is that a leader should succeed. A leader has to succeed. A leader must succeed. A country that tolerates leaders who fail is doomed. That's what Indians don't realize. Because in the past 70 years, we have been tolerating leader after leader after leader who have failed. Some of the most idolized so called leaders in India are failures. I think you can guess at some names. So, the number one rule of leadership, please remember this: a leader must succeed. A leader must succeed. So, Putin is succeeding and therefore he's a good leader. That's as simple as that. Priyanshu says everyone is talking about what this country should do and what that country should do. But what about the students and individuals who are all studying in colleges and universities in Ukraine? All their years of effort and money are in vain because in the present world, degree matters in various fields like medicine, engineering, etc. They all have to start from the beginning. How can the government help the students in terms of education? Yeah, good question. You are right. All those students who have who were in Ukraine, they will not be able to continue the education there, and essentially they've lost whatever time they spent in Ukraine. The thing is this: the government is not even duty bound, according to India's law and constitution, to organize an evacuation effort for Indian citizens. But it still did that. It is trying its best to bring back all of them. The vast majority of them have already been evacuated out of the country, out of Ukraine. And hopefully, in the next 24 to 48 hours, those who are left will be taken out to safety. So that's the first thing the Indian government needs to focus on. In the long run, what can we do about those students who lost everything? We need to reform the education system. Right now, what we have is most of the students, I believe, were studying for a medical degree. That's what I hear. And right now, we have the scenario of scarcity in the Indian education system. We have so many students who want medical degrees, who need medical degrees, but we don't have enough seats for them in our colleges and universities. So that is one of the problems. I think in the last 5 years, India has increased its capacity in medical seats by at least 70%. In the next 5 years, we may double it from what it is today. So if we are able to do that, then we will be able to absorb the students who are not able to get a seat in a medical college or course in India and who are forced to go abroad. So that's what we can do. But as of now, what the Indian government can do is to ensure that everybody comes back safe. That's all we can do as of today. Right? And in the long run, we need to reform the education system, which is terrible. India's education system is terrible. I will get into that shortly. Arjun Singh Rawat says, could you please shed some light on Chechnya and the Chechen special forces, who are believed to be one of the most brutal and ruthless soldiers in the world? It's a very interesting question. Chechnya. So I could give you a 3-hour account of the history of Chechnya, which is very interesting actually, but we don't have time for that, so I'll make it brief. Chechnya has an interesting history. As we know, Chechnya is an Islamic Muslim republic in Russia. Let's see where it is. It's in the Caucasus region. So this here, if you can see my mouse pointer, is the Caspian Sea. And this region here is Chechnya. The capital city is Grozny. All right. So it's in the Caucasus region. It is a Muslim republic in Russia. Now, if you look at the history of Chechnya, it wasn't always Muslim. The Islamization of this region happened just in the last 200 or 300 years, if I am not mistaken. It's not been a long time. So, what is Chechnya today? Chechnya, you could consider it to be, it's technically a republic or an administrative division in Russia, but the more accurate way of looking at Chechnya today is to consider it to be a semi-autonomous kingdom. So Chechnya is essentially a semi-autonomous kingdom within Russia. The ruler or the king of Chechnya is Kadyrov. What's his name? Ahmad Kadyrov? No, Ahmad Kadyrov was the father. What is his name? I forget. Ramzan Kadyrov. Let me share my screen. So the ruler or the king, the de facto king of Chechnya is Ramzan Kadyrov, this gentleman here. So he is absolutely loyal to Vladimir Putin. As you can see, he's facing Mr. Putin here. And in exchange for his absolute loyalty, he has been made the de facto king of Chechnya. And he has his own military, his own militia. So Chechnya. So if you look at Russia today, the overall growth of the population is actually negative in Russia. So it is below the replacement rate. The total fertility rate in Russia is below the replacement rate. But in Chechnya, the population is actually rising. So the rate of births in Chechnya is greater than the rate of deaths. So Chechnya is a great place from where you can get soldiers for the Russian army. And all of these soldiers are part of this private army of Mr. Ramzan Kadyrov, who is the son of Ahmad Kadyrov, who was a former rebel in Chechnya. So Chechnya tried to break free of Russia, become independent. There were two Chechen wars, one in the 1990s under Boris Yeltsin, yeah, and the Russians lost that war. And then a second Chechen war happened under Mr. Putin, and the Russians won. And so some of the rebels became pro Putin, pro Russia. And Ahmad Kadyrov's son is Mr. Ramzan Kadyrov, who is now the de facto king, you could say. He is completely loyal to Mr. Putin. He has his own army, and his army is loyal to Russia. And whenever it is needed, they will go and serve in the Russian army and take part in military operations. And that's what we are seeing right now. So I believe the Chechens have been sent into Ukraine, and they will be deployed and sent into battle, into a military operation if they are needed. And they have a reputation of being very brutal. So that's what I can explain in very brief. Very interesting part of the world. Okay, Saurabh says, what is the role of Japan in the whole geopolitical world? What are the choices of interest for Japan? The role of Japan is not much, unfortunately, today. And let me explain why. We have to go back to the map. So, Japan is essentially a satellite state, a client state of the United States. I do not regard Japan, unfortunately, as a sovereign country. And let me tell you why. Let me tell you why I do not regard Japan as a sovereign, independent nation. See, when you have a permanent military presence of another country on your soil, you cannot be considered to be a sovereign, independent nation. Let's go to Okinawa, shall we? So this is the island of Okinawa in Japan. Let's look at. So as you can see, there are a couple of airports here. Let's look at this one. It's called Ginowan. No, it's called the Marine Corps Air Station Futenma. So this is an American permanent military base. It's a permanent military base, American base. The American Marine Corps is stationed here, and their weapons and aircraft and all that will be found here. So these are American aircraft. These are helicopters and so on. So this is an American base in Japan, permanent base. This is another one. This is the Kadena Air Base, a United States Armed Force base again. And if you look at the kind of aircraft they have deployed here, these are American fighter planes and so on, right? And I can show you lots of other American military bases that have a permanent deployment in Japan. US military bases, Japan. Let's see. So you will have more. You will have many more in the mainland, also in the main part of Japan. US. Let's search for that again. As you can see, throughout Japan. So Japan essentially can be considered rightfully to be under American occupation. So what is the role of Japan? To do whatever the Americans tell them. That is the role of Japan. Japan has been under American occupation since 1945, since the end of the Second World War. The Japanese constitution was drafted under American supervision. It has not been changed, as far as I know, since the Americans drafted it. We had leaders like Mr. Abe, Mr. Shinzo Abe, who were in favor of changing the constitution, allowing the Japanese armed forces to have a more proactive and significant role. But for some reason, Mr. Abe had to step down from the prime ministership, apparently because of health reasons. And now he's no longer in power. Now we have a bunch of anonymous prime ministers, one after the other, who come and go, come and go, come and go. So Japan doesn't have much of a role in geopolitics. It is a powerful country. It has excellent submarines. Uh, the Chinese are scared of the Japanese submarines. It has an excellent industrial base. It is the most technologically advanced nation in the world, right? You could consider Japan to be a shadow nuclear power. If they want, they can have nuclear weapons next week. That's how advanced their technology is, and that's how advanced their technological capabilities are. They also have a very advanced space program, very good rockets and all that. So they could have nukes next week. They could have delivery systems for the nukes next week. But they are under US occupation. The Americans will not allow them to do it unless the Americans deem it to be useful for America, for the American national interest. So that is the role right now of Japan in geopolitics. Not very significant. Japan is not really a sovereign nation, unfortunately. Harsh Zaveri says, whose strategy is working effectively? NATO with its economic sanctions and freezing of Russian assets, or Russia with its offensive and gas oil related price pay? What's going to happen? Who will pin out first according to this? It is still to be seen. It's too early to say who's going to win. The Russians have opted for a military strategy, for a military uh, incursion, military intervention in Ukraine, and thus far it's working fine. Most likely in the next 10 days, they will achieve their objectives. So, from that perspective, they are doing well. Their strategy is working. NATO has dumped the mother of all sanctions on Russia. The Americans have dumped the entire kitchen sink at Russia. All the sanctions you can imagine, they've thrown at them. So, essentially, it gives Russia nothing more to lose. So, what the Americans have done, believe it or not, is they have pushed Russia into the Chinese arms. The Americans, by doing all this, have precipitated the bipolarization of the world. The Chinese and the Russians will now go ahead and try to create a separate international system, right? And they may even want, who knows, India to be part of the system. So if the Russians succeed in what they are doing, then it may give more leverage to India in negotiating with the US if it has an offer of joining this parallel system. But India obviously needs to be very careful because China is always a threat. So that's where we are right now. So the Americans, what they've done, it looks like it's been very counterproductive. It's going to precipitate the bipolarization of the world. It's going to show the world that American hegemony no longer works all the time. They were not able to prevent the Russians from taking over Ukraine. Ukraine was supposed to be in the American orbit, the next NATO member state, and see what happened. They could not save Ukraine. What about you next? Can they save you? So that's what we are seeing. So we are witnessing the slow decline of American power. So I would say that in the long run, it looks like the American empire is now in decline, and an Eastern Front may be in the ascendancy, but it still remains to be seen. See, no power will decline without a fight. Especially when you are becoming weaker, you will lash out more aggressively. So that's why the next decade is going to be a decade possibly of great chaos. The Russians may now try to bring Iran into their fold. The Iranians have been crippled by American sanctions for the past God knows how many years. Right? The Americans walked back from the Iran nuclear deal unilaterally after signing the agreement in an international agreement. They backstabbed Iran. So the Iranians are will be very happy to go into the Eastern Bloc with the Russians and the Chinese. The Pakistanis are already under the Chinese umbrella. So you could see a very rapid bipolarization of the world. And then it will be up to India to decide what it wants to do, what is best for India's national interest in the long run. So that's what we are witnessing right now. The world is in flux. Nepal. Oh, hello. Okay, let me read this out, then I will remove this. So the first question is, yes, Abhijit, this is the best way to repay all the Gurkha soldiers who have sacrificed their lives for India. They have fought 2 wars before retirement, and you thank them for the service by invading their homeland. And Swadesh Karki says, I am from Nepal, currently in the US. It's a long couple of paragraphs. What he's saying is that in Nepal, there are very limited people who understand all this, and their minds have been completely brainwashed, and so on. Yes. Okay. So I had said in one of last week's live streams that in case China invades Taiwan, India needs to secure Nepal and Sri Lanka. That's what I had said. And it looks like many people have interpreted this as me trying to say that India needs to invade and occupy Nepal. See, let's understand the India Nepal relationship. This gentleman mentioned the Gurkha soldiers. Let's understand the India Nepal relationship. It is a privileged relationship. India and Nepal have an open border. Indians don't need a visa to go to Nepal. Nepalese people don't need a visa to come to India. The border is open. You can just walk in and walk out. The citizens of Nepal have the right to come to India, work in India, and live in India as long as they want, their whole life if they want. They have the right to do this. They have the privilege of doing this. And the citizens of Nepal have the privilege, have the right to serve in the Indian armed forces, in the Indian army, in the defense of India. That is a privilege that only the citizens of Nepal have. Citizens of any other country don't have any of these privileges. We don't have an open border with Pakistan, Afghanistan. Afghanistan is out of the question temporarily. We don't have an open border with Pakistan, with Bangladesh, Burma, Sri Lanka, anything. Only the Nepalese citizens have these rights and privileges, and vice versa. It works both ways. So it's a privileged relationship. We have an open border, right? And so I will be perfectly happy if Nepal remains an independent country in this manner for the rest of eternity. I said India needs to secure Nepal's territorial integrity because we know what the Chinese have been doing. They have taken over the whole of Tibet. They are biting at Arunachal. They are taking bites out of Bhutan. They're taking bites out of all of their neighbors. They will, in the case of a conflict with India, try to use Nepalese territory to make incursions into India. They will not respect Nepal's territorial integrity or sovereignty. And like the other gentleman said, Nepalese have been brainwashed today, right? And the roots of that lie in the regime change that was done in the 1990s when the Maoists came to power and the Nepalese monarchy was destroyed, right? And after the Maoists came into power, the entire brainwashing of youngsters started. And today it looks like lots of Nepalese have a very strong anti-India sentiment. Let me tell you guys something, my Nepalese friends, in case you're watching. We are the same people. The Nepalese are the descendants of Lord Ram, Lord Krishna, right? And so are the Indians. I mean, I believe that one of the previous Nepalese prime ministers even tried to claim that Lord Ram was born in Nepal and so on. So we are the same people. Indians are the descendants of the Mauryans. So are the Nepalese. We're the same people. We have an open border. Let it remain the way it is. India doesn't have any ambitions to take away Nepal's sovereignty. I think Nepal has done very well. It has, in some ways, been able to preserve its culture better than India. I think it would be best if India doesn't dump socialism and secularism on Nepal, right? So India needs to secure Nepal's territorial integrity and sovereignty in case of any Chinese misadventure. That's all I was saying. And the same goes for Sri Lanka. Indians like to talk about these days about Akhand Bharat. Akhand Bharat doesn't need to be a single monolithic empire. It can be a confederation of allied states who all share the same culture and civilization. It doesn't mean that they have to be under one single political dispensation, right? So we can have a United States of Akhand Bharat with a number of independent sovereign states within them, but who all share the same culture and civilization in the long run, not today, tomorrow, next week. So please understand that I do not have I am not recommending that India should invade Nepal and take away Nepal's sovereignty. Nepal is doing very well on its own, and we have an excellent, open, privileged relationship with Nepal. Why can't it continue the same way? If Tibet had been independent, we would have had most likely a similar kind of relationship with Tibet as well, with open borders and so on and so forth. Maybe when the world is a better place, we can have that too. But please understand, my Nepalese friends, we have no ambitions of taking over Nepal. We just want Nepal to stay secure and sovereign and independent. And please understand this: China is not your friend. China is not the friend of the Nepalese people or the Nepalese nation. It's not. Okay, let's take one more question. Education. Clear warning, very demonic. Our education system is garbage. Mind your language, brother. And the other person is saying, our country has the most intellectuals in the world, and and we are building UAE. We have sewage workers and the IT field and all that. So never bring down your motherland in your heart, even on, especially on an open platform. Do correct your viewpoint. And there's more. Indian education system is not garbage. Don't speak irresponsibly. Please don't say it is garbage. Our education system is on par with the global system. And Janavi says, please don't comment on anything you're not sure of. Please get your facts right. Your comments are not ridiculing the education system, is not in good taste, and so on and so forth. So that's what many people are saying. Because last week I had said that India's education system is garbage. Maybe I used a very strong term, but I stand by what I said. India's education system is one of the worst in the world. You all, my dear friends, I don't blame you for feeling this way, but please realize that the education system is not serving you. Let me show you. Okay, so let me tell you what is wrong with the education system. There is extremely poor quality of faculty and teachers. Do you realize that? There is a lot of politics in the education system. You have reservations. You have incompetence in the staff, in the teachers. The education system prioritizes the staff over the students. There is a commercialization of the education system. Degrees are a commodity to be sold these days. You are forced to memorize things, not to understand anything. You don't know what is right or wrong, what is good or bad. You're not taught these things. You are not allowed to question the teacher. You are forced to be under a state of absolute obedience. The education system tells you what to think, not how to think. It educates you just enough to believe what they teach you, but not enough for you to question what they teach you. Do you know that the basic qualification required for a clerk is the same as the basic education required for an IAS officer? Graduation. The degrees are worthless. The education is in a foreign language. It's creating cyber coolies. You have this artificial scarcity. More students, less seats. India is spending billions of dollars in foreign exchange to send its students to other countries to educate them. And you know what's the funny thing? When Indian students go to foreign countries to get an education, they mostly study under Indian professors who are working there. Do you understand how terribly broken the education system is? So India's education system is terrible, whether you realize it or not. Please don't react emotionally when you come across information that you don't expect or you don't agree with. Try and understand what the person is trying to say. And if you're truly interested in understanding what is wrong with the education system, then I can give you a pointer. Will give you a recommendation. Just one second. Let me share my screen. So, if you are truly interested in knowing what is wrong with the education system, watch episode 30. Ask Abhijit, episode 30 on this channel. It is available on this channel. Please watch this episode if you are truly interested in understanding what are the problems and what are the solutions that we need to implement in the Indian education system. So that is what I will leave you with. We have crossed the 2 hour mark, so let us end this session for today. So thank you everybody for watching. And once again, let me, before I end, remind you that I have created a separate new channel, short clips channel. The link is in the description. Go to the description, and the link is also here. It is youtube.com/Abhijit Chavda clips. In case you want to watch short clips of each individual answer instead of watching a 2 hour long session, which I would perfectly understand why, then please subscribe to this channel. All right, everybody, thank you very much for very interesting questions. Tomorrow I will take more questions. Tomorrow I will take some questions from video chat as well. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Until then, take care. Thank you very much. Bye.